but it's much harder to formulate the language in my mind than to understand what it is. I'm very happy to be here with you. If for whatever reason you don't understand what I'm saying and I need to slow down or rephrase it, please let me know. I'm happy to do that. We're a small group, so I want to make sure that everyone can understand. It is my pleasure to be here today representing the American Embassy in Warsaw. I am a political officer, and my present assignment is I handle political military affairs between the United States and Poland. And as part of that portfolio, I have included also NATO, missile defense, upcoming aviation detachment that I will talk about, and a number of things. So while I'm not an expert on all of those issues, I am familiar with U.S. policy on those issues. So I encourage you to ask questions. This is your opportunity. This is a very small setting. I'm happy to talk about any subject. There really isn't anything that's off limits. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. If it is something that I can't answer, I'll just say I can't answer. But for the most part, I anticipate that I hopefully can answer all of your questions. Yesterday, the NATO summit in Chicago began. And there was an afternoon full of activities by the North Atlantic Council, which was the meeting of all of the heads of state of the 28 NATO partners. And the meeting was of the heads of state and one advisor, very intimate gathering. President Komorowski is attending, obviously from Poland, along with his delegation, including the foreign minister, the defense minister, and several others. What we hope, let me tell you what the U.S. hopes to get out of the NATO summit. There are three topics that are on the agenda for the NATO summit. The first is Afghanistan, and the second is the NATO capabilities, and the third is NATO partnerships. Talking about Afghanistan, at the NATO summit 2 years ago in Lisbon, NATO adopted a plan for the end of the Afghan operation, for transition away from what is ISAF, which is the International Security Forces in Afghanistan, to Afghan control of their country for their own security. The NATO summit will confirm that the plans we made in Lisbon are the plans going forward, and will broaden, get to more details about what that plan is. Just so you're aware, the plan for Afghan transition is in 2013, the ISAF forces, the NATO forces, will transition from an active combat role to more of a support and training role, with the idea that in 2014, control for the security of Afghanistan will transfer completely to Afghan national forces, the army and the police. And there will be probably a small NATO contingent that is still there to conduct training and support functions. So by 2014, ISAF, NATO, hopes to end and plans to end all of its combat operations in Afghanistan. Now, once security for Afghanistan is transferred over to the Afghan National Security Forces, we are also looking in Chicago to lay out the framework for sustaining, for supporting those Afghan forces. The cost for that sustainment, we think, is about $4 billion dollars a year. And the United States will pick up the very large majority of that, but we have asked our allies to also donate funds to that. And that's an issue that the Polish government is dealing with right now, on what level of support Poland will provide for the Afghan forces post-2014. The Afghans will have about 345,000 soldiers and policemen in 2014, and our analysts tell us that that is enough to maintain control. We shall see, right? Not everyone is optimistic, but we've been in Afghanistan for a long time, and none of us, I think, want to be there any longer. And so we will do our best to transition in a responsible way. Then moving on past Afghanistan, we will get to the issue of capabilities. And this is where we get into really the future of NATO. what do NATO members see as the future of the alliance? President Obama has recently said and reaffirmed many times that NATO is the most successful alliance in human history, right? It has successfully prevented conflict as opposed to engage and win conflict. And it continues to be a successful organization. The fundamental element of NATO that is most important is what's called, please, is Article 5. Article 5 is Article number 5 of the NATO Charter, and it lays out a principle of common defense. And that principle is an attack on one ally is an attack on all allies, and that all allies are bound to come to the support of one of the NATO members that is attacked. Now, Article 5 doesn't say what the nature of that support has to be, but it is understood that if one country is attacked militarily, all the other countries will come to that country's defense militarily. The only time Article 5 has ever been invoked was in September of 2001 in response to the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And it is under that rubric of Article 5 that the Afghan mission is ongoing. So that's why, if you wonder why does Poland have troops in Afghanistan and why do other NATO allies have troops in Afghanistan, it is because NATO invoked Article 5 and members of NATO stood up to go to Afghanistan in the common defense of, whether it really works for common defense because Afghanistan is very far away, that's another debate, but that's the only time it's been used. So when we look at NATO, the foundation of NATO is this Article 5. And that's a very important concept. Article 5 is what gives everyone, all of the member countries, the confidence that they are not alone in the world and that they are protected, that someone has their back. But the question as we move forward is, in a Europe and a transatlantic region that is increasingly, and I don't want to say increasingly, but has basically won the conflict for which the organization was created, right? NATO was created in 1949 as the Western counter to what we saw as the aggressive Soviet Union. Now that 20 years have passed since that aggressive Soviet Union has gone away and NATO has won that conflict, what purpose does NATO still have? Is there still an enemy out there to which NATO needs to exist to respond to a threat? And that's a very interesting question. And that is a question that is presently kind of dividing the alliance. Poland is on one side of that argument. And Poland's side of that argument is while that aggressive Soviet threat no longer exists, Russia still exists. And Russia, while not as threatening as the Soviet Union, still could pose a threat. And Poland, because of your geography, feels that very intensely. On the other side of that debate, you have the Germans and the French, who do not view Russia as a threat. And that creates some internal problems within NATO, particularly when it comes to planning, when it comes to putting plans in place and capabilities in place to counter a major war. And right now there's disagreement between Poland and other Western European members of the alliance over what level of capability NATO needs to sustain. Because many in Germany and in France and Belgium and Denmark and other places, or the Netherlands, not Denmark, think that NATO's capabilities do not need to be as high as to defend against, for example, a Russian aggression. And Poland and others strongly disagree. So that's a problem. It's not a problem without a solution. I think we will have a solution and it will work out. But it's part of the fundamental discussion about what is the future of NATO. Why does NATO exist? From the United States perspective, NATO exists because it is the cornerstone, the most important piece of our strategic security planning in the world. NATO is our, Europe, the Secretary Clinton said in Munich that Europe is our partner of first resort, that we have a special relationship with Europe, and we feel a special responsibility with Europe to also protect the security not only of the European region, but perhaps other areas that may somehow threaten the European region. So, but all this is against the background of the U.S., much like the rest of Europe, is cutting our defense budget. And very soon, plans have been announced to reduce our military footprint here in Europe, to reduce the number of troops that are assigned in Europe. And as the U.S. looks more to the Pacific region, to China, to India, to those areas where we think perhaps the greater threat to our security future exists than here in Europe. So we're kind of pulling out. I'm going to talk about our relationship with Poland in just a moment, particularly, but in Europe writ large in general, yes, we're reducing our presence. But at the same time, you have the European financial crisis. And what the United States would hope is that Europe would take greater responsibility for its own security and begin spending more to fill in the gap. Any gap that was caused by the U.S. pulling away would be filled in by the European partners. But in Europe, most of Europe, unlike Poland, defense spending is going down. And in Poland, defense spending, fortunately, is going up. That is because defense spending in Poland is tied to your GDP. And as your GDP continues to grow because you have economic growth, your defense spending continues to grow. And under Polish law, Poland must spend 1.95% of its GDP on defense spending. And from the United States perspective, we love that. That is fantastic. NATO has a benchmark of 2%. So Poland is right about at the 2%. Unfortunately, a lot of Europe is nowhere near that 2%. And so there is big concern that as the United States stands down in Europe, that NATO will no longer have the capabilities in place in Europe to do the kinds of things that NATO wants to do. To counter this, there are several, NATO has done several things. One, they have introduced a concept that's called smart defense. Smart defense means that the NATO countries in the alliance come together and basically pool their resources, combine their resources to purchase capabilities for NATO that individual countries cannot purchase on their own. The best example of this is a program called AGS, which is the Alliance Ground Surveillance System. The agreement for AGS was signed just yesterday afternoon in Chicago by all of the all the NATO defense ministers. And what AGS is you all know what UAVs are? An unmanned aerial vehicle, a drone, okay? It's a drone called a Global Hawk. And when I think drones, you may think small, right? That a drone could fit in this room. A Global Hawk is big. It's big like an F-16. It's huge. And it has all kinds of equipment on it that allow for surveillance of ground troops. And it is a capability that NATO itself does not have, and that the countries within NATO outside of the United States does not have. So under this program, the NATO countries have pooled together funding. We hope that Poland will re-engage on that effort, and they're making efforts to do that, to purchase a bunch of these Global Hawks to have this capability. And that's the example of smart defense, which is we know that we have less money, but if we pool together our money, we can get better capability. The real push for some of these things was the NATO mission in Libya from last year, okay? At the NATO mission in Libya, while most of the, I'll say the heavy lifting, the combat strikes were conducted not by the United States, but by European nations, the majority of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which we call ISR, had to be conducted by the United States because the other alliance members don't have that capability. So AGS is an example of where the members will come together to pool their money to get a capability that individually they don't have. Another example of that is missile defense, which is NATO has decided that the threat of ballistic missiles, not from Russia, but ballistic missiles from Iran, for example, could threaten the transatlantic region. So there is a NATO missile defense program that will be funded in large part by the United States, but also contributed to by NATO to provide missile defense against a ballistic missile threat from the Middle East predominantly. So that's another example of smart defense. But all of these things go to the capabilities of NATO. And it's the idea that NATO needs to find better, smarter ways to spend its money, because all of us, no country has enough money for defense. And then finally, the last topic of the Chicago conference will be partnerships. And the idea is NATO has 28 members, but it also has, in Afghanistan, for example, in addition to all 28 members, there are also troops and support from 22 non-NATO members in Afghanistan. And these partners come from the Persian Gulf region, from the Far East, from North Africa, and the idea for NATO is to increasingly take advantage of these relationships with our partners to hopefully defuse security risks in other parts of the world before they become real risks to Europe and to North America. And so there will be an increased focus on basically expanding the reach of NATO and its influence so that we have partners that we can work with in other places of the world. So that's what they're going to talk about in Chicago. And none of that is really groundbreaking. It is not going to be a huge, noteworthy summit. Lisbon was big. Lisbon was a big summit. In addition to the Afghanistan piece, Lisbon also revealed the new strategic concept for NATO, which every 10 years or so, NATO puts out its mission statement, what NATO hopes to accomplish, and that's called a strategic concept. And it talks about how NATO looks at the world, at what threats exist, and how we will organize ourselves to combat those risks. And among the risks that we see, in addition to terrorism, cybersecurity is very big. Proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and missile technologies is very big. Threats to our shipping lanes, very big through piracy. And then energy security is also a big deal. So these are all things that NATO looks at. And from the U.S. perspective, we value NATO very highly. And we think that not only militarily, but also politically, that it is an organization that exists, that has bodies that have already been created, where the member states can get together and talk about problems in the world in a constructive way, using already existing mechanisms. Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski last week gave a speech in advance of the NATO summit, and kind of the theme of his speech was the reports of the death. He quoted Mark Twain, an American writer, that the reports of NATO's death were premature, right? That a lot of people had said that NATO did not have a future. And Minister Sikorski argued, no, NATO does have a future, and it has a bright future. But NATO needs to adapt. And I think that's exactly what the United States would say. NATO just needs to adapt and needs to focus on what its missions will be. Now, the NATO summit will go on against the backdrop of also, there's one big player in the world that will not, aside from China, that will not be in Chicago, and that is President Putin will not be in Chicago. There will be under the NATO framework, there is a NATO-Russian Council, the NRC, that meets periodically, and it's existed for 15 years. And the purpose of the NRC is to develop greater cooperation and greater understanding and trust between NATO and Russia. Many people thought that there would be a meeting of the NRC in Chicago along with the summit, as there usually has been. But President Putin apparently is very busy setting up his government in Russia, and so he's not able to attend. I believe Prime Minister Medvedev is going. But the Russia issue, it continues to be a perplexing question in how to deal with that, because Russia has very much its own interests. But also, Russia is perceived in different ways, particularly in NATO, as I talked before, by members of the alliance, and that causes difficulty. The U.S. very publicly, when the Obama administration came into power 3.5 years ago, launched what was called a reset of our policy with Russia. That we just want to back up and just let's start over, and let's have friendly, cooperative engagement. I mean, the result of that has been, honestly, not that much different than what we had prior to the reset. And it only, I think, further drives home the point that Russia has its own interests and will pursue its own interest always. And that those interests don't necessarily match up to the interests of the United States or the rest of NATO. Now, that doesn't mean that we are enemies, but it does mean that maybe there's limited opportunity for cooperation. Russia is not a fan of missile defense, right? Russia does not like NATO's missile defense program. This, despite the fact that NATO's missile defense program even when it is fully implemented, will not have the capability to fend off Russian strike. It just won't. Russia has, countless nuclear weapons, and the missile defense system that will be created will not have the capability to make a dent in anything if Russia ever decided to launch a strike. Nonetheless, Russia's nervous because particularly phase 4 of the missile defense program, which shouldn't go online until 2020 at the very earliest, could potentially have the capability of shooting down an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM. And for Russia, they take that as a threat to their strategic security. And I guess I can kind of understand where they're coming from, except for the fact that the science really does not, in order to really counter what the Russians have in their nuclear arsenal, we would have to have 1,000 sites like the one we will put in Rechikova. And honestly, we're going to put one site in Rechikova. That's it. So, but that's problematic, and it's especially problematic when the Russians, like they did a couple of weeks ago, saber rattle when they threaten members of the alliance, particularly Poland, with a preemptive strike to destroy the missile base if it's constructed. Now, that's a problem for everyone, and my perspective is the NATO Secretary General spoke out pretty forcefully and said that's not acceptable. The reality from the U.S. side is we would say those statements were made by Makarov, is that his name? The chief of defense, Makarov? Anyway, those statements were made by the Russian chief of defense, General Chenyev's contemporary, or counterpart. The U.S. position is the policy of the Russian government does not coincide with the statements necessarily made by this general. But that being the case, it's troublesome when Russia says that. And the U.S.'s goal will be to ensure that Russia understands that missile defense is not a threat to Russia. And our position would be statements like that are not constructive, they are harmful and they are threatening, and they are not necessary because, as we have said and continue to say, the purpose of NATO's missile defense is not to counter Russia. It is to counter a rogue nation that, with whom we do not have the relationship like we have with Russia. But, that's a problem. And I can understand for Poland that the U.S. relationship with Russia is always a topic of interest, and that a perception that the U.S. has warmer ties to Russia could be problematic from Poland's view. Now, whether the U.S. has a warmer relationship with Russia or not, I don't think we do. But, that being the case, I think all of us would agree that more contact with Russia is better than less contact with Russia, in the sense that we would hope that with those with whom we have dialogue, we tend not to get into conflicts with. So we hope that's the case. But yeah, I'm not a Russia expert, and clearly Putin has his own agenda. I think he has, one of the real reasons why he honestly didn't go to Moscow, or to Chicago, I think, is because he has issues at home that he needs to deal with. And we'll see how he deals with those. It's very interesting with the protests that are going on and things like that to try to see 2 or 3 years down the road in Russia to see what Russia will be. And I don't think any of us can make those predictions. But, now I want to talk briefly about the U.S., specifically our relationship with Poland. I mentioned that the United States militarily is reducing its presence in Europe, and that's true. But in Poland, the United States is increasing our presence. In November, the U.S. will open we don't use the word permanent, but we use the word enduring, aviation detachment. What that means is we will have initially 12 of our Air Force members that will move to Wask Air Base, very nearby here, right? Isn't Wask? Just down the road, right? That they will be stationed here at Wask permanently, but they will be assigned here, and quarterly, every 2 or 3 months, a rotation, a squadron of U.S. F-16s or U.S. Hercules C-130s will come to Wask Air Base and stay for several weeks and do training missions. So beginning early 2013, you will see U.S. F-16s and U.S. C-130s flying around Wask Air Base. That is from, my background is I'm former military, I'm former Air Force. I was in the Air Force before I joined the State Department. I will tell you the significance of the U.S. Aviation Detachment is those airmen that will be assigned to WASP will be in Poland in a different character than any U.S. forces have ever been. They will be permanently, again, the word permanent we don't like to use, but they will be permanently assigned to Poland to be stationed in Poland under the control and command of EUCOM out of Germany. Now we have lots of U.S. soldiers and airmen that come to Poland all the time. A lot of them are stationed here and they're under what's called Chief of Mission Authority, which means they belong to the embassy, right? They might as well be diplomats. We have others that come under the NATO flag as part of NATO. But these troops that will come to WASC are the first in the history of our relationship with Poland that are coming as basically U.S. forces stationed in Poland. And that is a difference that maybe doesn't make as much sense, that is hard to understand why that's important. From my perspective, that's extremely important because we are now basing our airmen, we will be starting in November in Poland. And we have never before based our troops in Poland. Now, that will start modestly, but the idea is that that can grow, and that detachment of 12 can grow to a larger detachment and increase presence in the future. I'm involved in the negotiations now for all the agreements that need to be signed between our two governments for these airmen to come here. And these are things like how to get a driver's license, how to register their car, how to pay taxes, how to have their goods shipped in through customs. I mean, there are all of these very detailed issues that we need to resolve before we can base our soldiers here. The reason we're doing those agreements now is because we've never had them before. But once we sign them, they're in place. And once they're in place, it becomes much easier in the future for us to send additional soldiers or additional airmen here. When the missile defense base that will be in Regekovo opens in 2018, we will have anywhere from 100 to 200 U.S. soldiers that permanently man that installation. And so, I guess what I want to say is U.S. presence in cooperation with Poland is going to increase in the future, not decrease, even as we decrease throughout Europe. And from our perspective, that is very significant. We have these little pamphlets that I gave to Mihao that you can all have. They're blue pamphlets, unfortunately they're in English, that are about the status of our military cooperation with Poland. The reason we did these pamphlets is because the ambassador felt like that there's a lot of critique in Polish society, perhaps, that the U.S. and Poland are not as engaged as maybe they used to be.